Right, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the keynote address of the Equality Equals Conference here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for the afternoon, Dr. Dana Cloud. My name, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Robert McDonald, and I'm a PhD student here in the Department of Communication Studies at UNC. And I'd first like to thank all of the conference participants and attendees. I think the panels thus far have been really lively and really terrific. And I'm also really looking forward to those of you who will be presenting and attending on Saturday. And next I want to give a big thanks to the Department of Communication Studies itself, as well as the Comm Studies Graduate Student Association and the Graduate and Professional Student Federation for their support and for their funding. And finally, I'd like to give a massive, massive round of applause, if you will, to the conference organizers and the volunteers. They've been working really hard for months on what is actually a sort of unique endeavor by graduate students here, and we're all indebted to them for bringing us together. So, round of applause. So, I'm here to talk about equality. I think we all are. And in one way, when I consider the term equality and what that term demands of us as intellectuals, in communication studies, Dana's name comes to me first and foremost. She represents to me the height of a genuine commitment to political and economic equality, and for that she inspires many of us to see our scholarship and our commitments to the world as part of the same struggle. Because of this commitment to equality, she acts in a way that affords her scholarship, her teaching, her mentoring, and her activism equal weight. Her scholarly work links struggles over the popular with popular struggles for justice. She can both perceive the trace of a utopia in a reality television show and the ideological trace of neoliberal capitalism in therapeutic self-help discourse. Her work has been featured prominently in critical studies in mass communication, critical studies in media communication, communication theory, communication and critical cultural studies, rhetoric and public affairs, the Western Journal of Communication, and many, many other forums. And she's also the recent author of her second book, which is entitled We Are the Union, Democratic Unionism, and Dissent at Boeing, published by the University of Illinois Press. For these achievements, and for many others, the Rhetoric and Communication Division at NCA bestowed upon Dana their Distinguished Scholar Award this past year in 2012. But in addition to that, she gives weight to her service to her department at the University of Texas at Austin as the Director of Graduate Studies, and in her truly outstanding mentoring and advising to graduate students. Full disclosure, I had the privilege of being her advisee at Texas when I was a master's student, so I'm clearly predisposed to believe this. But I'm grateful that she's sort of driven to guide the paths of future intellectuals in the field of communication studies. And she's been honored for her undergraduate and her graduate teaching as well. The Western States Communication Association gave her their Master Teaching Award as well in 2012. It's been a really good year for Dana Cloud, I would say. So, lastly, Dana has been a leader and a participant in almost every social justice cause and campaign in Austin and within her university. For everything from gender pay gaps to domestic partner benefits, marriage equality, anti-sweatshop labor, capital punishment, the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, defending attacks on workers at their jobs, protecting the environment, unlawful immigrant detention, and lately, as she mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the fights to save public schooling in Texas. Am I missing anything? Okay, good.
Did you say LGBT?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, you got that. All right.
She has never been able to see one struggle for justice apart from its necessary interconnection with the rest of how this society is organized. She lives the credo that an injury to one is an injury to all. So in a paradoxical way, or perhaps yet in a neat dialectical reversal, Dr. Cloud is an absolute singularity. Someone without equal. Not in spite of, but because of her firm commitments to the idea of equality in politics, culture, and the mode of production. I know Dana is not a big fan of Tony Negri, but I agree with his assessment that communism is the organization of singularities. But I agree with him only insofar as each of us, as organized singularities, share the courage, the intellect, and the ambition of Dana Cloud. In a world where all that is solid melts into the fungible and to the exchangeable, when the term equality is shorn of its force and mutated into equity, Dana Cloud, her work and her life as a singularity stand out, but stand out in the hope that all peoples in the world may stand as equals. Comrades, sisters and brothers, friends, presenting her work on pushing the boundaries of liberalism, revolutionary equality in the rhetoric of GetEQUAL, the incomparable Dr. Dana Cloud.
That was a really sweet introduction, so thank you very much. It felt like we entered the 19th century in the second part of the introduction, I don't know why. Then we got back to Negri, and I'm like, okay, we're back. Let's honor this again. And I also, like Robert, wanted to thank the conference organizers who have been so great to me through travel, trials, and tribulations, and transportation, trouble. Sorry, massive alliteration. And of course through inviting me to be here with you, and I'm so grateful to the department and to all of the entities that Robert mentioned. And I really want to thank Armand for all of the things that he's done. So basically, this lecture describes debates in the LGBTQ community on marriage equality as the centerpiece of the modern LGBTQ movement. Whereas one camp of this movement uses the language of equal rights to argue for full inclusion in the institutions, including marriage and society as they exist. The other decries these goals in favor of the language and tactics of various expressions of liberatory goals that challenge dominant norms. Today I'm going to argue that there is a third line of argument suggested by feminist theorist Zilla Eisenstein, who argued that the arguments for mainstream liberal or equality feminism could not help but run aground on a fundamental contradiction. Namely, one cannot argue for inclusion without acknowledging that one is advocating on behalf of oppressed classes. The language of individual rights is ultimately incompatible with the goal of ending oppression. However, I will argue that the demand for full equality usefully stretches the rhetoric of equal rights, and that struggles won on this basis may lay the ground for more system-challenging aims. I should also say that I come to this as a scholar, obviously, media critic and movement critic and etc. And so I bring to bear not just my academic work here, but my activism since 2008 and the passage of Proposition 8 in California, where that galvanized the movement in Austin, Texas, where I live. And it has seen ebbs and flows. I think the high point of the movement up until about this week for me was in 2009 when there was a massive march for equality in Washington, D.C. Not that you would know it from mainstream news media. But there were 300,000 people. We took 160 from Texas on various kinds of caravanning transportation. We rewrote the Stars at Night Are Big and Bright, Deep Art in the Heart of Texas, so that we could sing about, we marched around Washington singing the song. And we had a rainbow queermadillo on our shirts, and I think, I'm kind of old school, right? But there are all these young people, a whole new generation of activists who are out there right now. And actually, I think we're at a really important turning point in history. A turning point that's characterized by this question. WTF, I'm not going to say what it is. But I want you to watch these two videos before I go any further. Robert is helping me.
Welcome back to Harlow. It's no secret the Supreme Court justices are aware of popular opinion when they decide cases, and the background music, if you will, for this week's two gay marriage cases was the dramatic shift in the public's attitude on that matter. Here's what we found in our latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. In 2009, not 100 years ago, 2009, only 32% of African Americans supported same-sex marriage, while a majority of African Americans, 53%, were opposed. But by December of last year, 2012, the percentage supporting in that community, supporting same-sex marriage had jumped to a majority, 51%. And the biggest jump in support for gay marriage was among blue-collar workers of all ethnic groups. Back in 2004, only 18% were in favor. Now, with 80% opposed back then, 4 out of 5 opposed, by December of 2012, there'd been a spectacular shift in opinion. Now, 47% approved gay marriage, just 43% disapproved. Joy Reid is meant.
So Chris Matthews, we're not surprised that he is heralding the advent of shifts in popular opinion on marriage equality. Take a look at this next one. Oh, oops, I didn't mean to do that.
But why are they changing?
Well, because I think that the same-sex marriage advocates have done a credible job of getting
This is
out
the
there and
O'Reilly
making their case. I mean, for years, those who oppose gay marriage take the religion piece out of it for this, because there's no arguing that. I mean, the Christian religion teaches what it teaches. The Bible says what it says, I mean, about marriage and
But our policy shouldn't be made by
I
that.
know, so take that out of it.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that when you ask, for example, I had an interview with Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council. What is it about calling marriage, calling a gay union marriage that offends you? How does it hurt a traditional or a heterosexual marriage? And I didn't hear anything articulated that was particularly persuasive. What people go back
And I
to.
agree with you 100%.
Right.
100%, and I hate to say this, Kelly, and next week I agree with you 100%.
Oh, okay.
The compelling argument is on the side of homosexuals. That's where the compelling argument is. We're Americans. We just want to be treated like everybody else. That's a compelling argument. And to deny that, you've got to have a very strong argument on the other side. And the other side hasn't been able to do anything but thump the Bible.
Their best argument thus far has been, well, marriage is an institution that for 2,000 years has been about a man or woman
And that's
creating
it.
babies.
That's
and
right.
Procreation.
Procreation
But
is
today-
what.
But look how society has changed. I mean, people, they talked today about would we be okay passing a law saying people over 55 can't get married because they're not likely to have babies.
Not to use it off for a minute, I don't want to. I support civil unions, I always have, all right? Anyway, the gay marriage thing, I don't feel that strongly about it one way or the other.
Then
I
it's
think
to the
it's-
states.
I think the state should do it.
I think the
Right.
Supreme Court's going to come down and
New York
decide
has it
letting
now.
the democratic process
Right.
play
New
out
York,
in
I live
the
in
states.
New York, New York has its fun with it, all right? I want all Americans to be happy, I do.
I mean, okay, so, this is why the WTF. Up until about 2 weeks ago, I would have told you that I thought marriage equality was still a pretty radical demand. And within a very short space of time, there's been this massive transformation in public opinion that has coincided with the hearing in the Supreme Court of the 2 cases around Prop 8 and DOMA that could decide things on a federal level or on a state level. Could we turn the front lights down just slightly? I think we got it over here. But who knew, really, that the groundswell that had been the movement, and frankly, after 2009, it had gotten a little quiet for a while, and then things were picking up, and then the Supreme Court cases hit, and it was just that moment. It was just that moment, and I think I said that all these young people now are sort of on the cusp of making history, and it's super exciting. I mean, I'll be there too, but I mean, I'm just saying that this is their time. So what I want to talk about is how important social movements are to the process of changing popular opinion, to influencing political decisions, and also to influencing the Supreme Court, which is not immune from popular opinion. Anyone who knows about historic politicized cases knows this. So, I mean, it was the Nixon court, for example, that handed down Roe v. Wade. Just saying. Okay, so basically, there are a number of groups out there, and the one group that has kind of carried the banner since 2009 is GetEQUAL. They're powerful in different degrees, to different degrees in different states, but they are a forward activist organization, and they have been putting enormous pressure on politicians. And what I'm going to argue is, on the one hand, there's this case that, oh, equality is so conservative, right? We don't want the sameness, we don't want to assimilate, we don't want to do that. And then on the other hand, you have a number of queer liberatory perspectives and anarchist perspectives that are like, so they're saying equality stinks, and then you've got the more conservative groups like the Human Rights Coalition who are basically saying, the system is great, let's just enter it. Bill O'Reilly, go. And Bill O'Reilly. So I think that there's a third way, and it has to do with defining the concept of equality in a third way that is more militant. And so I'm going to talk about how it pushes some of the boundaries of and does particular kinds of ideological work. And I also think that as a case study, it offers a lesson in how movements articulate themselves to dominant values while still mounting effective pressure on those values and institutions. So, preview, I'm going to talk about GetEQUAL. I wish I could see my computer in that way I could not look at the screen, but I can see what would be better here. So I'm going to talk about GetEQUAL in the context of civil rights movements, and then talk about equality as an ideograph, which is a theoretical concept in communication studies and rhetorical studies, and talk about it in the civil rights movement, in the LGBT movement, and talk about tensions in that movement. And then when I critique or analyze the GetEQUAL rhetoric, I'll be talking about how they critique mainstream organizations and the political system, how they express solidarity with other groups and causes, and how, and this is going to be the most important part, they elevate tactics to the status of ideology in their militant actions. And I hope that what that means will become clear as we go. The first concept to introduce to you is the concept of ideograph, introduced to the field in 1980 by Michael Calvin McGee. And he defined the ideograph as a culturally biased abstract word or phrase drawn from ordinary language which serves as a constitutional value for a historically situated collectivity. Put another way, it means that there are some slogans and terms and combinations of words and single words into which we have put massive investment. For example, the Constitution, literally constitutional words, liberty and equality are words like that. There are many other sorts of ideographs. People keep arguing that there are new ones all the time, but he's mainly interested in how these dominant terms, how they capture the sensibility of a people, but over history, they change in their inflection. Different communities and different people at different times invest those concepts with different meaning. But the whole time, you're carrying on in society and somebody says, we're for equality. Well, how could you be against equality, right? So there's a kind of a compelling force also to the ideograph. And so McGee said what we have to do is use the study of the ideograph to discover the commitments of our group, of our nation, of our people, of our class, and so on. And he also said that we need to understand it in a slice of time, and we also need to understand it historically across time to see what changes have happened. So equality as an ideograph is bound up with the ideas of identity and integration. That there is a sense in the political tradition of the United States and the Republican traditions in general that equality is a matter of opportunity and reform, expanding inclusion, and not about what people would say equality of outcome. And it also has traditionally required upon the suspension of difference as sort of a condition for entry into the community governed by the God term equality. In liberalism, which I'm defining, I should have said this before, as not the opposite of conservatism, but as the political philosophy that emerged alongside the bourgeois revolutions of the late 18th century, for example, in the United States and France, earlier in England, and then not, and then again. And then in France, not, and then again. So it's complicated, but basically the emergence of a new kind of society organized economically differently based on mercantile exchange first and then industry second, where the ideals of privacy from government interference, individual human rights, basically the right to be left alone as a definition of liberty, prevailed as a sort of language that captured the interests of the rising class against arbitrary authority of aristocrats and so on. Definitely an improvement, but still associated with the interests of that rising class and new social order. So it's always been in tension in our tradition with liberty. Liberty, if you had to rank your ideographs, for example, in some social welfare states, equality might rank higher than liberty, but in the United States, liberty generally ranks higher than equality because manifesting equality for everyone would definitely infringe on some people's liberties, right? So, but with regard to equality, we can talk about how it unfolded in the civil rights movement. John Lucades and Celeste Condon have a very good book called Crafting Equality. I think the citation might be on the next slide, where they talk about how there were three kinds of equality that emerged in the struggle for black civil rights. First, against slavery, and then Jim Crow, and then in the post-war era, where they talk about how social equality was basically an implicit sense that groups of people lived side by side, but there were not any legal or institutional reforms. And that then, when the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s emerged, brought about some integrated versions of the term equality, so that reform of existing institutions, inclusion in the right to vote, both in principle and in practice, and the dismantling of Jim Crow laws segregating the South. And then finally, they talk about in the rhetoric of black nationalists like Malcolm X or the Black Panthers, that there is a more kind of substantial demand for an equality. And there are two aspects to that. There's a material dimension to it, so that equality comes with stuff. It's not just kind of a pie-in-the-sky abstraction. And the second thing is that equality, they call it also power equality, where it's where your group maintains its difference and its identity and demands, I think recognition from the prior panel is really important, on equal terms, and inclusion in a really different way. And that's important to know, because these variations are occurring right now in the LGBTQ. And in fact, they just came to a head. If anybody's on Facebook talking about marriage equality, you might know, for example, that the equal sign is the logo of the Human Rights Campaign, a fairly conservative gay rights organization, and a proponent of marriage equality. Then there's a whole movement, and they use the greater than sign, but the movement is called Against Equality, where some of them you've started to see equality with the line through it, but that would be confusing, I mean, in terms of confusing them with some of the right-wing conservative positions, basically orienting around this idea of difference and that we don't want your bourgeois norms, right? We're going to maintain ourselves. And the third way that I'm going to talk about, so integration is separatist, is the solidaristic version of equality, which I see represented in GetEQUAL, and that's their logo. I asked my friend Tiffany, who's an activist in GetEQUAL, and you'll see pictures of her in a minute. I asked her what the third bar meant, and she said, well, it meant different things, but for me it's meant that you're signaling the willingness to get arrested. In other words, the third bar means, yes, we're for equality, but we're not taking any shit in the meantime, right? We're gonna be in your face about it. So we're not the Human Rights Campaign. So briefly on the question of the Human Rights Campaign, there are organizations like that, also the Lesbian and Gay Rights Lobby of various states and so on, basically take the position, like I said, of basic inclusion in the structures that exist of society without calling those structures into question. So, and they've done really good work. They've put a lot of money behind marriage equality and the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which are very important. However, they are an extremely professionalized movement organization, not an activist-based organization. So basically the extent of your involvement is to give them money. And again, I'm not going to totally bash that, but they are also tied to a sort of mainstream Democratic Party mostly and Chamber of Commerce politics. And mainly this expresses itself in sort of being free to own bars. I mean, I don't know how else to put this. Free to shop, right? One of my favorite slogans on a gay liberation march was, we're here, we're queer, and we're not going shopping. I mean, that actually meant something, right? Because of the way that this integrationist mode has linked itself to the corporate economy. So that in Austin, the Gay Pride Parade is only floats that are sponsored by businesses, right? And if you're a movement organization, you have to pay equal to what the businesses pay to get a place. Occupy Austin did actually crash Pride, which was fantastic, along with GetEQUAL. So, but I'm just saying, so that's the politics we're talking about there. Their version of marriage is fairly conservative, and I wanted you to listen for a minute. Recently, maybe last week, Hillary Clinton put out this video, which is in support of the Human Rights Campaign, and you can see their goals are there, and you can listen to the themes that she stresses when she talks in the language of the Human Rights Campaign about equality.
Traveling the world these past 4
It's very
years
dark, I'm sorry.
reaffirmed and deepened my pride in our country and the ideals we stand for. It also inspired and challenged me to think anew about who we are and the values we represent to the world. Now, having left public office, I want to share some of what I've learned and what I've come to believe. For America to continue leading in the world, there is work we must do here at home. That means investing in our people, our economy, our national security. It also means working every day as citizens, as communities, as a country, to live up to our highest ideals and continue our long march to a more perfect union. LGBT Americans are our colleagues, our teachers, our soldiers, our friends, our loved ones. And they are full and equal citizens and deserve the rights of citizenship. That includes marriage. That's why I support marriage for lesbian and gay couples. I support it personally and as a matter of policy and law, embedded in a broader effort to advance equality and opportunity for LGBT Americans and all Americans. Like so many others, my personal views have been shaped over time by people I have known and loved, by my experience representing our nation on the world stage, my devotion to law and human rights, and the guiding principles of my faith. Marriage, after all, is a fundamental building block of our society. A great joy and, yes, a great responsibility. A few years ago, Bill and I celebrated as married the love of her life, and I wish every parent that same joy. To deny the opportunity to any of our daughters and sons solely on the basis of who they are and who they love is to deny them the chance to live up to their own God-given potential. Throughout our history, as our nation has become even more dedicated to the protection of liberty and justice for all, more open to the contributions of all our citizens, it has also become stronger, more competitive, more ready for the future. It benefits every American when we continue on that path.
So I know that's a little dull because she apparently has taken a page from the Public Speaking Handbook of LBJ, where, but you just finished the sentence already. But I needed you to listen to the whole thing because you can hear the refrains about incorporation into the political system in a non-critical kind of way, articulating equality to the American tradition, to opportunity again, to the idea of our shared future, which has a lot to do with the economy and including people in the economic production and consumption of our nation. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I think it's getting dimmer. Okay, thanks. So just so you can hear that language. Then there is a whole category of activists, and you know, this is not new. I mean, it comes out of Stonewall, which we were talking about a little bit earlier, that groups like the Gay Liberation Front, taking their name from the North Vietnamese Army, and other groups, which ended up being Queer Nation and ACT UP over time, maintained that the norms and institutions of liberal society were not desirable goals for them. And that they wanted to define themselves as different, and I think we can approach this, I'm not going to say a lot about this, through the study of identity frames that Bedford and Snow and a lot of other people do, but just real quick. An identity frame is an interpretive schema that simplifies and condenses the world out there by selectively punctuating and encoding objects, situations, events, experiences, and sequences of action with one's present or past environment. And so when the queer liberation movement calls itself queer in a naming kind of way, that's also a framing action that defines them in opposition to some of the other values. And so the anti-equality movement right now is definitely operating in that frame. There are also a number of anarchist activists in there, and they make a lot of good points that I'm not going to deny, but basically, I'm gonna find what I want to read. So, I wanted to quote to you a little bit from some representatives of this, talking about beyond marriage, not marriage, and here's a little bit of this from Lisa Detner. If we are to imagine queer futures that don't replicate the same violence and oppression many of us experience on an everyday basis as queer and trans folks, we must challenge the middle-class neoliberal war machine known as the National Gay Marriage Campaign. We must fight the rhetoric of equality and inclusion in systems of domination like marriage and the military, and stop believing that our participation in those institutions is more important than questioning those institutions' legitimacy altogether. We need to call out the National Marriage Campaign as opportunistic and parasitic. We must challenge their money-mongering tactics to assure our local, truly community-based LGBT organizations aren't left financially high and dry while offering the few essential services to the most marginalized of our community. And this is something that organizers in various states have taken up. And to a certain extent, they have a point. First of all, the critique of the allegedly conservative nature of the demand. And secondly, the broader economic and anti-racist and pro-trans demands. For example, marriage equality doesn't make a lot of sense to trans youth who have been expelled from their homes and need proper identification that matches their gender expression, right? I mean, so in terms of poverty, homelessness, exclusion, there are many projects that we could be taking up. And so they're perhaps rightly angry that so much resource and activist attention is going into the marriage campaign. I'm going to say something about how social movements work in a little bit and try to answer that back a little bit. But, they're critiquing equality as a sameness, right? And I'm about to say that not all equality is sameness. In fact, what they're doing is, the BillRicoProject.org, it's the world's largest LGBTQ blog. And I think that basically, rather than the greater than sign, basically the division sign is what's at work there, emphasizing difference, liberty, utopianism, basically saying, we're going to imagine a future that's different from this. We're not going to participate in your future, right? Involving cultural change, challenging a class basis of the HRC movement, but also challenging, affiliated with an anarchist, we could talk a long time about this, tendency to romanticize what Marx called the lumpen proletariat, people who were truly down and out and on the margins of society. And so I keep asking myself, and I have asked myself, and I've experienced this, the question about whether we can unite this radical critique with the current demand for marriage equality. And on the face of it, they seem not quite to go together. But we can talk now about GetEQUAL. I think they're doing something a little different. And you can hear it in their language. So I'll just tell you that their mission is to empower, this is from the website, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community and our allies to take bold action to demand full legal and social equality and to hold accountable those who stand in the way. Vision, a society in which LGBTQ people experience equal protection under the law without caveat or compromise. So they're both using the ideograph equality and criticizing it at the same time. Like, we know this is potentially a compromise, but we're not going to compromise, right? We know that we're buying in partially to the rhetoric of the mainstream and the Democratic Party and so on, but we are going to hold those people accountable. So it's twisted a little bit. And that's why I think the question of method actually changes the nature of the ideograph, that their tactical work shifts the meaning of the ideograph, which seems on its face ideologically to resonate with the HRC, but actually opens up, I think, the ideograph to something much more promising. So the first thing to talk about their vision is that they have a pretty strong critique of mainstream politics. This is a short clip of an intervention that they made.
A lot of you are aware of how deeply bothered
Fundraiser.
it is about the environment.
Barbara Boxer.
vital work to pursue a clean energy future. And that work's vitally important. But what I also want you to know is that this is a woman who has a deep passion for fighting for you. Fighting for all her constituents here in California. She's passionate about fighting for jobs. Jobs with good wages. Jobs with good benefits.
Heckled. About don't ask
She's
no questions.
passionate about fighting for California's families. We are going to do that. Hey, hold on a second. We are going to do that. So,
Do you hear the irony in the yes we can? Okay, just making sure.
there we go. All right. Guys. All right. I agree. Now. No, listen. What the young man was talking about was we need to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which I agree with, and which we have begun to do.
So actually, the movement, they do these sort of political zap attacks in different situations, but this was a fundraiser for Barbara Boxer. And actually, we're very uncivil. We can talk about being civilized or polite or decorous or whatever later. But they actually caused President Obama to stop what he was doing and say, yes, we are going to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I agree with you, right? I mean, right there, like in the space of a minute and a half. I mean, it's just really, I think it's really quite remarkable as a tactic, and it kind of represents what I'm saying about the non-allegiance to the Democratic Party, the urgency and non-compromise stance, and really demanding a version of equality that eventually the system will not be able to provide. Okay, so this is the big hairy part. I can't open that access for you, which I had planned, but I think that the computer thing is just too crazy. But there is something about the use of what Heyman called body rhetoric, the use of confrontational and militant tactics that turns the ideographic quality into a critical ideograph. It says equality, get out of our way, and it's kind of like that. And this is how I teach social movements, and this is classic me, where I think that I always say, we should never confuse the fact that there is an ideological axis in movements and there is a tactical axis in movements, and they are not the same thing. All right, so you can have a reform versus revolution ideologically, you can have a militant versus moderate tactic, and then people can spread out over the quadrants, and I always say that it gets very confusing if you keep talking about militants and revolutionaries as the same thing, or if you keep talking about moderates, right? I mean, we need conceptual clarity on this. But scrap all that, because, I still think it works. And there's a third axis which has to do with nationalism and separatism. But basically what GetEQUAL does is takes those axes and goes like this with them. And I think that what DeLuca says, even though I disagree with him on most things, that he says unruly bodies have argumentative force. In other words, the very unruliness of it has an ideological or an idea content to it. Using bodies to contest norms, eschew conventional goals, disrupt standard meetings, and provide a vision of a different world. And the picture there is of my friend Tiffany, I know you can't see, with two other people locked down at the county clerk's office in the demand for marriage equality. And so basically they're doing something that could on the face of it seem kind of like, oh, we want to go to the chapel and we want to get married. But it actually is, we're going to sit here with ourselves locked together until the police drag us away. And that adds a layer, I think, in terms of the vision of a different world that they're talking about. The second big thing is about solidarity. I think that the people who in the anti-equality movement need to understand that there are parts of the movement that are not the HRC. Because GetEQUAL has always stood in solidarity with immigrant rights, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, end of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, the Defense of Marriage Act, but also trans rights, labor, many of the people who started out active as activists in GetEQUAL are still active, but they were hounded from the military, and they also have a critique of the war, even though their careers were invested in the military. They basically argue that we should have safety and dignity in our persons, and that we should actually redistribute goods of society in an equitable way. This is not the same thing as let me be on your faculty, right? It's not the same thing as let me buy a house in the suburbs. It's not the same. It's not the same thing. I mean, that's what I'm trying to tell you. Not that there's anything wrong. I have a house in the suburbs, and I am on a faculty. But I think that what's going on is that GetEQUAL, like so many movements before, serves as the left flank of the movement. Herbert Haynes, in a really important book that too few people read, Black Radicals in the Civil Rights Mainstream, documents how the moderates of any movement are going to take a lot of heat from the militants. And the militants in any movement are going to take a lot of heat from the moderates. And the moderates are going to go around saying, you are ruining things, stop being so militant, they won't like us if you drive around topless on motorcycles, they will not, they will not cooperate if we don't play by the rules. And what everybody misunderstands about how social movements work historically in the United States and in a Western democratic context is that the left flank pretty much is always completely necessary for the achievement of even the most modest reforms. So it is not an accident in the civil rights movement when SNCC, CORE, and eventually the Black Panther Party emerge as a counterweight to the SCLC. And I mean, there are so many great stories that one could tell, but one is from Eyes on the Prize, and it's Ossie Davis, who was an actor in Cosby. You remember? He's the grandfather. Well, he was a member of the Nation of Islam, and he revered Malcolm X. And he was talking to the interviewer, and he said, we would go to City Hall, and I'd be sitting there with the man, and I'd say, yeah, all we're asking for is, voting rights. We think we should be able to vote, and that you agree with that, yeah? And you better kind of listen to me because outside the door is the other brother. I mean, that's what he said. And he said, you may not be able to reason with them so well, right? And that is the dynamic of the left flank. And I think that, therefore, I am not bashing the anti-equality movement, right? I am saying that the emergence of that is a natural product of the historical moment we're in, that marriage equality seems to be on the cusp of actually being realized in this country, therefore it will become an achieved reform and something that is part of the system, and therefore we will need to carry on in all of these ways that GetEQUAL is about. I wanted to read to you before I get into this, a bit of a speech from another GetEQUAL activist, Katie Fye, who happens also to be my spouse. So she was giving a speech at a rally, basically talking about marriage equality, and she says, as other allies remind us, we are so much more than marriage. We cannot stop fighting until all of us are equal under the law. We cannot stop fighting until we win ENDA and end workplace discrimination. It is a crime that in 29 states you can be fired or not hired based on sexual orientation. It is a crime that in 37 states you can be fired or not hired based on gender presentation. We cannot stop fighting until the day no one has to show ID to use a restroom. We cannot stop fighting until every queer child and every queer's child is safe from the bullying of straight and cisgender administrators, teachers, parents, and peers. We cannot stop fighting until we are free to be and love whom and how we choose. As a socialist, I see the trillions spent on the war, bank bailouts, and tax cuts for the rich, and wonder why that money isn't being spent on housing the homeless, feeding the hungry, ensuring our health, and educating our children. The burdens of austerity and inequality are borne disproportionately by queer youth and queer workers, especially trans youth and workers, more especially among queer youth and workers of color. A fight against our government's insane priorities is a fight for LGBTQ lives, dignity, and rights. We are all in this together. This is the last paragraph. It's all kind of important. Now, it doesn't take much courage for a politician to come out in support of what the majority of the country already supports, and I didn't come out here today to thank them for coming part of the way with us. I came here to revel in the power of our movement, from the Stonewall riots to the Harvey Milk's movement in San Francisco, from the Compton lunch counter riot to the Supreme Court. We have refused to sit quietly and wait to be handed our rights. We always knew we were equal. Politicians are just catching up. And so you can hear in that speech, which I thought was a brilliant speech. But exactly the complexity of the argument about equality that's being made, and about tactics and about method. So, so to kind of recap a little bit, we can hear language choices and movements about how we define ideographs differently based on the place that we occupy in the movement. And sorry, there's a typo there, but for sort of gay incorporated, there's an integrationist definition of equality. For queer liberation, there's a difference-oriented and kind of anti-equality. And then there's the third way, which I think GetEQUAL puts forward, which I think is akin to a socialist discourse that enables us to think through integration without giving up difference, and asks us to push reforms from below, knowing that existing institutions cannot continuously contain our demands. And so I kind of wanted to think through the idea of radical integration or revolutionary equality. And I mentioned this at the beginning. Zilla Eisenstein, a really famous radical feminist, wonderful scholar, she understood how the left flank of movements worked. And she said, do not criticize the liberal feminists, do not criticize the equality feminists, because they are doing this work. They are demanding entry into the corporate boardrooms and into the universities and into the political halls. But they're going to find out pretty soon that that's, they're going to be fought at every step of the way. I was just reading yesterday about how the ERA failed in Phyllis Schlafly in her campaign in the late 1970s. And in 1984, finally, the Equal Rights Amendment, which simply forbids discrimination on the basis of sex, was introduced in Congress in 1923 and has never been ratified. I mean, so she said what's going to happen is that we all want equality. We all want equality. And we're going to work toward it. But we're going to realize as we go that our current methods of asking, we can't ask anymore. I mean, we're going to have to actually demand. And secondly, what we're demanding is actually so threatening, even though we don't think so. We don't think marriage equality, well, I'll shift to the present. We don't think marriage equality is that threatening until you realize that up until like 3 weeks ago, it really, really was. I mean, and that if you think about, for example, integrating the military by race, or if you think about integrating marriage in the middle of the 1960s, about the Loving case, and Mildred Loving saying that marriage equality is like when she had the right to marry her husband across the race line, and that if you were standing in 1965 in the South and there's a case that says black people can marry white people, that is not a conservative thing. That is an explosion, right? It is an explosion with ramifications that we cannot know, and that we did not know until these things unfolded. And I think that what Eisenstein said is that getting real equality requires calling the system into question. And she said, and there was another person that I was reading who put this very similarly. I was just reading this earlier. That basically, liberalism makes us choose between equality and liberalism, between equality and freedom. And that what a revolutionary version of equality looks like is one where you don't have to sacrifice freedom, and that we will realize as we struggle for equality that we become free by continuing to go through the struggle. And so that's why I end with today, marriage equality, and tomorrow, the world. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
I want to thank everybody who made this media magic happen, because we were panicking. Yeah, so.
All right, so we have some time for Q&A and discussion, and I'll be moderating that. And just feel free to raise your hand at any time. I'll try to get your name if I know it, or an identifying marker of clothing, so I can identify you. Just so you don't feel obligated to sort of do the is it my time to raise my hand? So let's open it up.
How do you know that it's pressure from the left flank and not the accretion of all those contributions to the lobbyists and people coming out to their families and the